So good to see everybody here today. My name is Lynn Fendler from Michigan State University, and it's my pleasure today to introduce this, one of the highlighted presidential panels, this one with the topic Problematizing Comparison. Our first speaker is Professor Keita Takayama from the University of New England in New South Wales. Keita would like us to know that he is the father of 3 girls. Second speaker today is Bob Cowen from the University College of London Institute of Education, and he would like us to know that he is going to use a PowerPoint today, right? Yes, thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Lynn, for the introduction. Can you hear me okay? It sounds a bit echoey. Not really? It's too, yeah? What do I do then? Try not to use? Is it better? I don't know. All right, I'll try to, maybe you can do something there, over there. I don't know. Hi. Today I'm going to talk about the colonial legacies in comparative international education in dialogue with Bob Cowen. So let me just try and figure this out. How do I, okay. Oh, something is wrong, anyway. So my talk is going to be based upon 2 of the most recent writings of mine. And the first one is the extended introduction that I co-authored with the Reuben Arathi Sriprakashi and Reuben Cornell, which was titled Toward a Post-Colonial Comparative something is missing. Toward a Post-Colonial Comparative International Education, which has been published online, and I think it's slated for publication as a hard copy in May of this year. And then the next article is still in the pipeline, but it's scheduled to be published in Comparative Education at the end of this year. So that's toward a new articulation of comparative educations, the plural S. Here I'm drawing upon Bob's work here, cross-culturalizing research imagination. So this will be included in a special issue that David Phillips and Maria Manzo are currently putting together. So my talk will be based upon these 2 writings of mine. Now, I have 2 agendas that I want to pursue in this talk. The first one is I want to open up space for new kinds of knowledge, comparative education knowledge. And I want to talk about JCES, which stands for Japan Comparative Education Society, which is arguably one of the most established comparative education societies next to CIES. It began its history in 1965, and it had its first journal published in 1971, which the association currently has about 1,000 members. And I'm going to use JCES as a radical other from which we can learn something. And my second agenda is to deconstruct the dominant knowledge of CIE. And for that purpose, I'm going to talk about one of the legendary figures of the field, Isaac Leon Kandel. And I want to talk about the colonial entanglement of his scholarship at the turn of the century when the United States was rapidly expanding as an imperial state. And I'll try to pursue these 2 goals while staying in dialogue with Bob, who is sitting next to me, which is such an honor to be sitting next to him. So I'll be trying to engage with the dialogue with him as I pursue these 2 goals. In particular, I want to talk about 2 concepts that Bob have developed over the years. The first one is the notion of comparative educations, the plural S, and I'm going to critique it. And the second one is the notion of transitologies. If you don't know what that really means, please ask Bob. I'll explain. So the tool that I'm going to use, just quickly, to me, the post-colonial theoretical tools allows me to talk about relations of power, how relations of power underpin both knowledge and the possibilities of its production. It also allows me to talk about the problematic intellectual division of labor that the Alatas, who is based in Singapore, a sociologist, talks about. This notion of West as theory mills versus the rest as data mine that Quan-Xin Chen and Ryan Cornell in Southern Theory also problematizes. This notion of asymmetric ignorance and asymmetry of engagement. Basically, those of us in the center can afford not to know anything about what's going on in the periphery. But on the other hand, those in the periphery need to know exactly the tools that they are supposed to use in order to have their voices heard in the center. So let's critique this asymmetric ignorance and asymmetric engagement in the field of comparative education. Well, but there have been many, many scholars in the field, some of who are sitting in the audience right now, who have been raising the very same concern that I'm really concerned about. Back in 1982, J.P. Kelly and Altbach and Arnov stated the following: the field remains dominated by English-speaking world and scholars in the United States, Britain, Canada, and Australia. The major journals in the field are in English, as are most of the research studies. Moving on, 10 years later, by the way, Altbach in his 1991 presidential speech to CIES also makes a very, very similar point, but I won't go into that now. And then 10 years later, Arnov makes the following point: the growing body of literature from different regions of the world, whether in English or not, will continue to expand existing theoretical conceptual framework of comparative international education, eventually transforming the very boundaries of the field. It will help offset the hegemony of European and North American scholarship. So as you can see, Arnold was quite optimistic. But I would wonder whether this optimism about 15, 16 years ago was actually warranted. Heiho and Mundy, in probably the most widely read textbook, makes this following point: published histories of comparative education between the two world wars have tended to focus on prominent scholars in Europe and North America, and yet, in this period, comparative education was also being developed and taught in other parts of the world. This is arguably the first textbook text that recognizes the different comparative educations around the world. And in fact, the textbook talks about the history of Chinese comparative education society. But the problem with the textbook is that it's sort of added on. The inclusion of history of Chinese comparative education does not disrupt the Eurocentric, the kind of history that we're used to, the kind of Eurocentric history of the field, starting with Julian, Kendall, blah, 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 all the names that you know. Moving on, in 2011, Maria Manzo points out very clearly the existence of a hierarchical structure in the field of knowledge production wherein some countries occupy a central paradigmatic position for other countries located at the periphery. Despite this recognition, the book somehow exclusively focuses on the English language predominantly paradigmatic comparative education society. What about the discussion of WCCES, World Council of Comparative Education Societies? Yes, many scholars have been talking about WCCES as a sign indicating that the field has been celebrating plurality of the field. Great. Most characteristically, the following book really epitomizes the effort to celebrate the traditional plurality in the comparative education tradition and institutional history. That's the Mazeman and Bray and Manzo's 2007 book. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the common interests and common goals. So 40 or so national and regional CIEs recognize the plurality of institutional histories and traditions are celebrated. And then that's how Mark Bray, for example, uses the notion of comparative educations, drawing on Bob's work. Here's the problem. To me, the celebration of plurality is extremely limited. Why? Because it doesn't tackle the hierarchical relations and the hegemony of paradigmatic comparative education. And this celebration of plurality seems to be underpinned by the presumption of similarities in what counts as comparative education research. The similarities in terms of epistemological, ontological, and methodological assumptions that underpin comparative education research is assumed to be, by and large, similar. So it doesn't require any investigation into it. So to me, that's the problem. So the question I want to pose to everyone is, where are radically different dangerous? Dangerous in the sense that it refuses to be part of the dominant narrative of the paradigmatic comparative education. Where are the radically different, dangerous CIEs? To me, we need to recognize that radical difference, the otherness of the other, in order to cross-culturalize CIE research and knowledge. There you go. So now I want to talk about JCES. Is there anyone here who is actually part of JCES? Japan Comparative Education Society? Don't be shy. Oh, great. Yes, thanks, Brad. Great. So please correct me if I say anything incorrect. So I've been talking to a lot of JCES scholars, but not just anyone, but there's a particular group of scholars in JCES who identify themselves as area studies specialists. And I've been really intrigued by them because I didn't understand them. I really could not understand them. I read their studies and researches, really difficult to understand, difficult to appreciate the value of it, which makes me more and more interested in it. So I started interviewing them, many of them. So some of the characteristics of their research: extended field work, mastery of foreign language, and a contextual immersion. Nothing particularly surprising, right? Descriptive, very, very descriptive. And then what they call dictionary making. Extreme attention to details, differences and nuances, and complexities on the ground. And most importantly, aversion to theory application. Very heightened anxiety around the use of theory that is generated primarily in Western paradigmatic comparative education. Professor Otsuka would argue uncritical use of Western theory is another form of Orientalism. But at the same time, many scholars like Toru Umakoshi, who is the founder of this particular tradition in JCES, he recognized the intellectual dependency and the need to create its own comparative education. And to him, the answer was area study approach, a particular articulation of area study approach. And they reject the instrumentalist and a purposeful approach to data collection as exploitative. And the notion of wandering around, aimless walking around, is highly valued. And the notion of fieldwork that many JCES scholars talk about is really interesting. It's a process of self-transformation. It's the process where self is disintegrated. You need to be immersed fully in the context until yourself gets disintegrated. I've never heard of that. It's just such a new concept to me. And the direct experience of smell, noise, and the air, attainable only through an extended period of dwelling, is highly valued. And lastly, Yoshikazu Ogawa argued with a specialist of Chinese education, Korean and Chinese education, you have not made it as a comparative education researcher until your work is recognized by researchers in the country that you study. So in his case, Korean and Chinese. So clearly, their research is not directed towards us elsewhere. Some of the quotes based upon my interview with them: many published articles in journals like Comparative Education, Compare, CEI will be included here as well, are very much theory-driven, and more often than not, it feels that they are simply fitting data into the pre-existing theoretical frameworks. They read well because arguments are very coherently presented, but they tend to distort the reality on the ground. So I don't get much out of these studies. Interesting rejection. Research articles published in the English language journals are very shallow, as almost 60% of the articles are filled with discussions of theory and research methodology. Where are the original research findings of the authors? Theory is not something you can carelessly play with when you are young. This is young guy speaking, by the way. Theory development is something you might be able to engage after years and years of field work in a wide range of contexts. And theory is not something you try to develop alone. So what's so radical about it? What's so dangerous about JCES? To me, they reject the worship of theory that Quan-Shin Chen talks about in the book called Asia as Method, where universalism is assumed to be an epistemological given. And all these quotes that I have introduced seems to suggest epistemological diffidence. It also suggests a view of universalism as a horizon, as Quan-Shin Chen would argue, a horizon we may be able to move towards in the remote future, provided that we first compare notes based upon locally grounded knowledge. And then this notion of fieldwork is really, personally, to me, very interesting. It's a process of self-transformation. To me, it undercuts this empiricist separation between being and knowing. So, I don't know whether you find it radical or not, or just peculiar, strange. To me, it allows us to provincialize the way in which we take for granted about comparative education research in North America, or possibly in Europe. How do we create a cross-culturalizing dialogue by recognizing radically different conceptualization of comparative education so that we can begin to question the way in which we do research? Moving on. Now, I'm moving on to the next agenda, and I have no idea how much time I've got left, but I'm assuming that this is around 12 minutes and 30 seconds, right? Just halfway point. Right, good. All right, Isaac Kandel. Was that all right, actually? Yeah, okay, sorry. I'm jet lagged. Yeah. So, Isaac Kandel, a lot of people in the comparative education loves to talk about Kandel, and so do I. But I want to talk about it in a very different way. Erwin Epstein, in the book that we were all given in Vancouver, argues that no one gave shape to early 20th century scholarship in comparative education more than Kandel. Yes, he was a very significant figure. And Kandel's Comparative Education, published in 1933, has been described as the Bible in the field for many years to come. It set the stage in Europe and North America for the field's scholarly development in the years and decades that followed. And Professor Kazamias, who is sitting right in front of my eyes, argued that his liberal humanist motif needs to be remembered. But I'm going to argue the different kind of legacy needs to be remembered. Yes, he's been characterized as a champion of liberal humanism, national recognition of national difference, and internationalism. Just to show one quote, which is often quoted by many, many scholars who love to talk about Kandel. In order to understand and appreciate and evaluate the real meaning of the educational system of a nation, it is essential to know something of its history, traditions, of the forces and attitudes governing its social organization, of the political economic conditions that determines its development. But I do question whether or not he actually practiced it. I'm going to get to that later on. So in any case, he's been recognized as a great giant who saw, here I quote, who saw each nation as one which uniquely forged its own way, as opposed to viewing one nation's education system as superior to another. And a similar argument has been made by many, many scholars. Okay, let's go back to history. Candle at TC stands for Teachers College. He obtained a PhD from Teachers College in 1910, and at the time, there was a research institute called International Institute, established in 1923. And Professor Paul Monroe and Isaac Candle were the two major figures affiliated with the International Institute. And an International Institute published this journal called Educational Yearbook from 1924 to 1944. And Candle was the chief editor for that period. And during that time, Institute was commissioned to undertake evaluation of education systems in Puerto Rico and the Philippines, the two new acquisitions or two new possessions of United States at the time, right? At the completion of the Spanish-American War in 1898, I think that's when the Paris Treaty was signed, and United States was given Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam. There was one more. Anyway, all those possessions given up by Spanish Empire. So this was a time that America instituted public education in those new possessions, and there was a need to evaluate how things are going in those colonial possessions. And then Candle had a book called 25 Years of American Education in the United. And then in that book, published in 1924, there's a section called Education in the United States Possessions. And then it's got a chapter on the Philippines and Puerto Rico. But this was the context. This was what was happening geopolitically. Can you tell what's happening here? Who's the teacher here? Uncle Sam. What is he doing? Here I quote, "Now children, you've got to learn these lessons whether you want to or not. But just take a look at the class ahead of you and remember that in a little while you will feel as glad to be here as they are." So he's speaking to those four black kids sitting in the front row, telling them they are the new students to this class called Civilization. And what's written on the blackboard in the back? The consent of the governed is a good thing in theory, but very rare in fact. England has governed her colonies whether they consented or not. By not waiting for their consent, she has greatly advanced the world's civilization. U.S. must govern its new territories with or without their consent until they can govern themselves. So as you can see in that cartoon, which was published in 1899 in a magazine called Punk, there's a little boy right by the door that's supposedly a Native American girl or boy trying to read, but the textbook is upside down, as you can see. And outside the door, there's a little boy that's supposedly Chinese boy peeking inside. And there's an African American boy cleaning the window. And then white girls sitting in the back, they have their textbook says Nebraska, all those names of states. So this was the context. Both published in 1899. I got 5 more minutes. Great. What do I do? Speak 3 times faster. All right. So as you can see, benevolent United States is taking Cuba as an adopted child. And here on the right, who is this? 20th American president. What's his name? I got it somewhere. Yeah, President William McKinley. Here I quote him, "There was nothing left for us to do but to take them all," speaking about Filipinos here, "take them all and to educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them." And in that cartoon, the world is watching America, what America is going to do with Filipinos, whether they're going to return Filipino or they're going to keep them. What book does he have? The book, what does he say on the book? It says education and religion. It speaks the central role that religion and education played in order to justify American imperialism into new possessions. 1931 Education Yearbook, the one that the Institute publishes. Kendall edited this special issue called Education in Colonial Dependencies. Let's have a look at what he said. In the introduction, the civilized world is gradually extending its boundary, and the significance of educating vast millions of people who have hitherto been isolated and content with their own customs and traditions and occupations is being realized. The difference in cultural levels is often used to explain the failure of introducing American education system, which he considered as the most advanced experiment in democratic education. The reason why, in his opinion, education system introduced by America, United States, in the Philippines, in Puerto Rico, the reason why they failed is because they simply tried to implement the same thing. And that's wrong, because we need to take into consideration the civilizational gap. They are far lower in the civilizational ladder. We need to recognize. So the Kendall cautions readers about what he calls policy of assimilation. That is an attempt to transplant modern education systems to the native, living hitherto under primitive condition. So modern education system introduced to the backward people of the Near East and in colonial dependencies must be adapted to their cultures, folkways, and needs, so that their rich body of culture will be reshaped to meet modern conditions. 2 chapters in the book that he edited in 1924, as I said, had chapters on, I got 1 more minute, chapters on Philippines and Puerto Rico. Both chapters, I read them carefully, clearly legitimizes the logic of benevolent US imperial mission. In the chapter on the Philippines, it says the native languages are numerous and diverse. There is no literature worthwhile in any of them. Granted that he didn't write that, Kendall didn't write that, but these chapters were included in the book that he edited. No criticism provided. So to me, he accepts and endorses the US imperialist logic at the time. Benevolent US rule replaced the negligent Spanish rule to provide free, universal, modern education to assist the uncivilized natives to move up the evolutional scale. That makes us sort of question his discussion of respect for national difference, as I discussed earlier. It seems to me that it actually complements the imperial logic of civilizational gap. At least it was useless in order to critique this imperialist logic. Quite interestingly, his recognition of national character sits quite comfortably with his planetary will to civilize. Going back to your work, Professor Kazamias, I agree the legacy of Kendall needs to be remembered, but the kind of legacy that we should be remembering and embracing is a different kind. I would argue that into the 1960s, he continued to perpetuate the identical imperialist logic. I don't go into that, but to me, it perfectly fits with the modernization theory of the 60s and 70s at the time, which basically posit traditional societies as stagnant, static, unchanging entities that require interventions to enable them to undertake an effective transition to modernity. I know my time is up. Can you give me 2 minutes? Is that okay to wrap up? Sorry, Bob, I'm taking up your time.
No, he gets 2 more minutes too.
All right, oh, great. So I'm going to skip this one. So to me, what was I going to say? Yeah. So going back to Bob's work, this is a piece in year 2000. The history of the field are comforting. They conform a collective identity confirm the collective identity. They give us something to gossip about, and we can always ask our students or colleagues to read them when they ask tiresome questions, such as, what is comparative education? So Bob, I hope I disrupted that comfortable history of the field slightly. And then Bob's discussion of world of multiple comparative educations. I would argue that his discussion of multiple comparative educations was constrained within the paradigmatic comparative education. His discussion of multiplicity was constrained within the different traditions, methodologies, epistemological frameworks that are existing within the paradigmatic comparative education. I think we need to go beyond that. I like the word transitologies, just to define what he means by transitologies. Simultaneous collapse and reconstruction of a state apparatuses, social and economic stratification systems, and political visions of future in which education is given a major symbolic reconstructionist role. And he also talks about transitologies actually reveal new educational codings, the compression of political, economic power into educational forms. Then he says, many transitologies occur as empire of a variety of kinds expand. To me, this really applies to the turn of the century education in the United States and the role of Kendall. To me, the legacy of Kendall is unfortunately his inability to read transitologies at the time of the American imperial expansion. And to me, that is a legacy that we should be embracing and moving beyond. Thanks very much.
Okay. Sure? Is that for the thing? I don't think there's a talk today. There's no PowerPoint down here.
He's setting up.
There's a talk today. I can't actually hear anything in this hall. Can you hear me at the back? They say they can. Can you guys? Amazing. Is that Bob Lingard at the back? Hello, Bob. You're in the talk, don't worry. There's a bit of a problem. I love you. If you're not in the talk, just as much as I love you if you are in the talk. So to those of you whose names are not mentioned in this PowerPoint thing, love you anyway. Keita and I were in a sort of a dialogue. It wasn't very successful because I don't email very well, you see. So Keita's sending me all these brilliant emails, and I'm having to ask how do I reply from my students. And so we got started. I mean, I said, well, Hans was a very strange historian, and he said, well, Kandel's got some problems too, and that's about as far as we got. But I'm really pleased to be here with Keita, whose writings I always read. I seek them out, and I read them, except I haven't read the last couple. He did just in case it would affect me too much today, so I didn't read those yet. Is this one on the right, Keita? Which one is it? The big one. The trouble is I can't see over the podium. I feel like a small child. I'm not as tall as Keita. Are you going to hold the screen up for me? That's very kind. Right. Brilliant. Thanks very much. So I've got till about past, right?
Yes.
More or less, yeah. Thank you. No, thank you very much. This is my existential statement of today. I wish I could say I've been inspired by the brilliant talk by Antonio, but but I wasn't. I wrote this all by myself. And I think if you're going to grumble about comparative education, you have to sort of give some indication of where you're coming from and why you're grumbling. So I drew on my knowledge of classical music to draw up this list. I personally have been very excited by the new World Yearbooks of Education, which have come out since about 2005, when Colby and Crispin Jones stopped being the editors, and it transferred to a new group of very energetic, very intellectual editors, and I'm reading those have read those with enormous pleasure. They're making a difference in comparative. The other things which have excited me a great deal have been these other topics listed, such as, for example, the peculiar notion of the triple helix, which the European Union gets itself very excited about, and it looks great on paper, but it's not particularly clear what it's for, apart from looking great on paper. Perhaps, Heinz, you would explain that to me later. And recently I've gotten very excited about a range of posts, not least because of the work of Silova, and not least because of work which CIES has done on empires old and new. So these are among my favorite things, and the reason they're among my favorite things is they hint at new patterns of international power in relation to domestic politics. So what we're seeing, arguably, and what could be created is a comparative education which begins from thinking about international relations, political relations, international economic relations, international cultural relations, and worries about the new kinds of educational practices that are being created as those international political and economic relations intersect with domestic politics. And so that is why I personally am rather happy about the contemporary condition of comparative education as people invent new ways to think in order to understand this newish sort of world we're in. My personal word for it happens to be the word imperium, because I can spell that. I can't spell a number of these other newer words, Boblingard, but I can just about handle the notion of rethinking space. I've got that far. The things which I dislike, apart from the name of my own institution, which is University College London, Institute of Education London. This is not the most elegant possible name you could ever think of as a place to work. But in addition to disliking the name of the institution where I work now, I'm very irritated by the relocation of the university inside the economic sector, which has happened in quite a large number of countries, and the growth of managerialism in universities. This seems to me to be getting in the way of the creation of new knowledge. I'm very irritated by the destruction of teacher education in England and its replacement by a 19th century model of teacher training, which is justified on the basis of competence and so on. And I am a little bit excited but not happy about the probability that a large number of us are living in what Philip Bobbitt calls market states in his brilliant book, Shield of Achilles. And in particular, of course, I get very cross when managers keep defining low levels of competence and calling that quality improvement. It affects my comparative education, as do these words. I reject the word context in any discourse about comparative education. I suggest to you it is almost a meaningless word. I think that comparative education, which signs up to do robust and relevant research, has betrayed the intellectual universe to managerialism, and the notion of evidence-based policy is a worrying ideology, because the question is who judges what is evidence? Certainly not the academics. And thus, my final complaint before I address the question of problematizing comparative is this anxiety about there is no alternative to certain kinds of educational policies. You deduce educational policies from some notion of economic globalization. It's Mrs. Thatcher's concept of TINA, there is no alternative. Right, well, within that, the point is that we're getting some very fruitful contradictions emerging between the world as we once thought it was and the world that is emerging in front of us. And what we are getting, interestingly, from the universities is really quite a set of sharp criticisms that are coming out now and are a real pleasure to read. They include the authors listed below. A couple of people are here in the audience, so I won't embarrass them by mentioning their names. But Jeremy Rapley in Japan, working at Kyoto, if I remember correctly, is doing some very, very interesting theoretical work. My brilliant colleagues in the Institute who do strong comparative education include Gemma Moss, Paul Morris, and Peter Moss. And as always, it's the young scholars who excite me most. Shah Jahan has done some very, very interesting work on colonialism, post-coloniality, decolonization. And I wouldn't mention a couple of the other people who are here. Well, I might mention Kazimierz, perhaps, and Karnoy and Carney. I put them there because their names start with K. Everybody knows that. So it's brilliant new literature, but there is an elephant in the room. And what we're watching is the creation of applied comparative education. Its locus is not especially in the university, but its locus is in the political inter-national world. It includes, of course, PISA and the emerging PISA-D. It includes World Bank and concepts such as the world-class university, which is obviously intended for export. And it includes the very numerical work which has gone on recently on measuring education for all within the UNESCO umbrella, and it includes contract research. So my point at the moment is that these outfits are doing advocacy comparative education, they're doing action comparative education, and combined with contract comparative education, which is often done from a university base, it adds up to a whole new, I think it adds up to a new pattern of knowledge in its construction, applied comparative education. But of course what that does is it makes academic comparative education freer. It makes the stuff done in the university much freer to critique. It releases it from its simplistic managerialist obligations to deliver product, and it releases the voice of critique. And so for me, academic comparative education is now much more confidently becoming an analysis of the transfer, translation, and transformation of educational principles and practices as they move about, but particularly as they move under large political, economic, and cultural forces, and they intersect with domestic politics. There are several works which illustrate this well, but one which I came across most recently last summer is a brilliant new book by a guy called Meyer in sunny Albany, Design of the University. It's a superb analysis of the movement of, quotes, the German university to the States, and the way you have transfer, transform, and transfer, translate, and transform. It is brilliantly worked out, and en passant, there's a nice little, well, I'm not sure if it's en passant, but it's en passant, there's a nice destruction of the concept of world-class universities. So the point is there is a literature on this. Several people have actually worked on it, but that's never been an incredibly visible part of comparative education, because unfortunately the simplistic definition of comparative education is that it's about juxtaposition and comparison for the identification of similarities and differences. So stuck in that old form, it is very difficult to get anywhere beyond J.S. Mill's method of similarity and difference, and one thing left over, which is the cause. Well, this is in honor of Keita. Actually, it's not. It is a criticism of Mr. Trump. Because as Ruth Hayhoe will know, the photographer is Kash of Ottawa. And Kash was a poor Syrian migrant. And during the Second World War, when Winston Churchill was in Montreal, I think, maybe Quebec, Kash was given the job of photographing him. So Mr. Churchill looks ferocious and bulldog-like and very Second World War-ish. And the point is that Kash, who was a professional, walked across the room, took his cigar out of his mouth, put it in an ashtray, and then got the shot, because Mr. Churchill is very upset about the disappearance of his cigar. So it's a version of transfer, translate, transform. So to finish off the analysis, about 12 minutes? I've got 12 minutes, boss.
Yes.
Yeah?
At least 12.
Sorry?
15 is fine.
Thank you. To finish off the analysis, I want to look at three agendas, but in three slightly different forms of comparative education. The agendas are those of attention, approach, alliance, and action, and they apply to mid-Atlantic comparative. They do not apply to Italian comparative education. They do not apply to Spanish comparative education. They do not apply to German comparative, and I defer to Keita on whether they apply to comparative education East Asia. This is about the mid-Atlantic voice in comparative education. I'm going to now summarize it with extreme speed, a number of things loosely called comparative education. This first one, comparative education, I'm arguing that the agenda of attention is policy, and it didn't really shift much off policy. I don't really care whether Julian was the founding father of comparative education. Owen Epstein wrote an article recently suggesting there were alternative candidates. But notice that if we take Julian as a symbolic figure, that marches effortlessly through the 19th century, straight up to and including Edmund King. Comparative education's agenda of approach, the convention is to say 1960s methodology. I don't agree with that, although the participants in comparative education at the time said they were discussing methodology. I think they were discussing ontology. More particularly, they were discussing the social and political use of comparative education, especially making a tension between history, which was obviously useless, and science of one kind or another, which would obviously be useful. The agenda of Alliance for Comparative Education has always metaphorically been the Ministry of Education, in whatever vocabulary, aiming at power, aiming at advice. And comparative education's agenda of action has peculiarly been the sectors of education of interest to administrators, elementary, secondary, vocational, technical, and so on. And so we've been revising what might be loosely called in English the administrator's parts. The second form of, quotes, comparative education has gone through a number of changes of name. In London, for example, we had a department which was about education in the colonies, founded approximately 1927. And so the naming of the field gives you a hint. The agenda of attention has altered. For a while, the analysis was in terms of traditional societies or colonies. Then in London, it became tropical areas. Then we had the Third World, and so on. And it came on through to tigers of one kind or another, Asian tigers. Also, we had a Celtic tiger, and some increasingly powerful notions of the development state and the South. The agenda of approach has been a little strange. It's included grumbles about Confucianism, grumbles about corruption, and grumbles about people not meeting pattern variables created by Talcott Parsons. So those were the oldest interpretations. With more contemporary interpretations, obviously coming off to classical economic theory of land, labor, and capital, and human capital, with people like Phil Foster and Arnold Anderson and Walt Rostow being in that generation before we get through to new theorization within this field by people like Elaine Untitled on capability theory, and of course, a huge emphasis currently on sustainable development. And the agendas of alliance, obviously, are the huge agencies, including but also the NGOs, with national versions of this in Germany or France or even in Brazil under Lula. And the agendas of action have included identity targets. In other words, you will go for reforming gender definitions and relations. You will go for the peasant as a problem, or for that matter, you will go for teachers as the crucial change agent or educational managers and so on. And I remember that Laura, as a professor of comparative in London, thought that radio would solve most of the problems of development, and that mutated, of course, later into simple computers, and is currently the emphasis is on learned-centeredness. And the third modality is international education, which in a sense begins in its contemporary form less perhaps with the League of Nations and much more with UNESCO and the proposition that since war begins in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed. I personally think it's delightfully written. I wouldn't like to bet my reputation as an historian on whether that's a very good... I don't have a reputation as a historian, let it be quickly said, but I think that's lousy sociology. That really is silly sociology. And so the agenda of attention within international education shifts from things like peace after occupation in West Germany through to contemporary concerns with fragile states. International peace education goes way back to Betty Riordan and the World Orders Model Project in the States, and lots of work in the schools and all sorts of versions of intercultural education in Northern Ireland, Cyprus, and so on, through to VSO and the Peace Corps. And the agendas of alliance are multiple, but in the end they tend to come back to government foreign policy. What's my point? Well, my point is that what we've got is each of these fields of study is going through what I call routine messianic moments. So you have a big shock about, we won't use history, we'll use science. Or you have a big shock about, we really shouldn't be looking at the colonies, we'll call them tropical areas. And so each of the fields of these mini fields of study go through routine messianic moments when they grasp they've been wrong, and they relabel themselves or redefine their core concerns. And I think that the interesting thing is the action of the fields of study. And again, I borrow from Churchill with his emphasis on Did you see that one? The one before this one?
Yes.
You saw Action This Day.
Yes.
This is what Mr. Churchill used to write on memoranda to his civil servants or his generals who tended to want to have dinner instead of acting. So the mutations inside comparative include the methods wars, they include discovery of the posts. They were intended jokes. And the interesting and exciting moment, I think, is the sort of thing that Keita was talking about, the emergence at the moment of considerable anxiety about whether we have been excessively Western, offering Western Weltanschauungen. To what extent have we overlooked completely the question of decolonization? So I think those are pretty interesting, but what has Comparative done? Actually, what is done brilliantly, if you think about it, it's scripted inequalities. It's written brilliantly about them. If you start with Weber's thing on the Chinese literati and the shift into 19th century, the cultivated versus the expert, that is writing about a form of inequality, because there will be an old world full of Chinese literati and a new world full of European experts. Equally, the classic paper by, let us say, Turner on sponsored and contest mobility is nominally about the States and England, but actually, if we think about it, it's about the construction of forms of inequality, because by definition, sponsored mobility is going to block a very large number of young people at a very early age. And so Turner scripted brilliantly sociological analysis of inequality. And you can keep coming on through, including notions of space and time, which Professor Nobber did brilliantly this morning. Inside the development field of study, you get those sorts of mutations which include inventing and stressing post-colonialism, which include inventing and stressing the concept of the South, which include deciding that contextualization or context was a real nuisance, and it was because it was a severe blockage. But what was it a severe blockage to? It was a severe blockage to French or English or whatever ideas going into the places that the French and English and so on wanted them to go into. And so a great deal of the work recently is actually on a construction of a geometry of insertion, which I would argue is P to D. Yeah. And so what happens is that in that subfield, you get forms of action which actually write out forms of inequality. They write them out in rituals and songs. They write them out around the rubric, what education says you cannot become. This is a crucial motif. Thank you. Thank you. This becomes a crucial motif. In certain societies, education defines what you cannot become, because you don't speak English or you don't speak French. You do not have access to the metropolitan language. And so the colonial education system is telling you that you are locked as a Bumiputra, or you're locked as a Chinese immigrant into Malaya, or you are an Indian immigrant into Malaya, and depending on your identity, etc., plus your languages, the English, British forms of education in Malaya are telling you what you cannot become. Equally, education in developing countries, which is a later form, actually etches or chisels or carves out the concept of the unequal South. In action, it writes it out for you. And of course, it makes distinctions between donor and recipient and so on. So EID, Education International Development, does something slightly different. It exports chickens, it exports solutions, it exports pedagogic solutions, evaluative solutions, and of course they're very, very modern chickens. Let me leave that for the moment, because I want to finish fairly calmly. I want to emphasize that in the present moment, we're getting through Education International Development and through international education a division of the world into the good and the bad, the civilized and the barbaric. So obviously Libya is uncivilized and barbaric, obviously Afghanistan is uncivilized and barbaric, and we're getting a distinction in political universes between the good, which are axiomatically coherent and stable, and the bad, which are fragmented and fragile states. And this is the last crucial intellectual point. We're getting the construction of universes which, in the vocabulary of the theoretician whose name is on the PowerPoint, Martin White, we're getting the creation of a concept of universes of three kinds. One is a good universe, which is a Lockean one. A Lockean universe is rationalist. A Lockean universe is about discussion, debate, and reason. The nasty universe, the bad universe, is Hobbes' universe, where life is nasty, brutish, and short. And the just about acceptable one is a moral universe, one informed by a moral imperative, e.g. a Muslim universe, or perhaps a communist universe, a Marxist universe. And within that, I'm suggesting that comparative education in developing countries, and what I've called international education, are actually addressing three different worlds, and they are constructing three different worlds, and they have different political purposes. So the three universities I've talked about are dramatically different, and in general they're subordinated under the same kinds of vocabulary. I'm suggesting that in each of those three different universes, each form, e.g. comparative or education, international development, or comparative, education development countries, and international education actually create different forms of inequality. And I'm suggesting that although none of them want to create a Hobbesian world, comparative education is concentrating on creating a rational world, a world of discussion, discourse, exchange of views, this sort of thing. But that is not praise, that is an analytic position. It's what Martin White would have called a rational universe. And education in developing countries, they're rescuing a Hobbesian world in which life can be nasty, deeply unfair, and so on. And they are trying to create a world which is being created because of a Kantian view of the universe, a universalization of what it is to be human. It's a moral universe. And the bottom line on it is perfectly simple. I think that what we have tended to call comparative education has finally split into four strands. One strand, which I just invented today, or more precisely, which I labeled today, is applied comparative education. It has remarkably little to do with the university, although it draws upon university social sciences, including testing sciences. The second version of comparative education is what I've called comparative education, which is, in my argument, has now been freed to be critical, thoughtful, analytical, difficult, because we've got an applied comparative education, and we can stop thinking that comparative education is mainly about gradualist, reformist policy improvement. The third form is what can loosely be called education developing countries, which offers a very powerful moral vision, but also which of course creates inequalities, because it defines one section of the world as in need of help, of development, on certain terms. And the fourth form of comparative education, which I distinguished, was international brackets peace brackets education. International education concerned with the proposition, since war begins in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed. So what we have tended to put under the title Comparative is probably now split into 4 different identities with different political assumptions and different agendas of action. And so my argument is simply the closing one there. We're going to have to be very, very patient with each other, because we now have 4 possibilities for really angry discussion at very, very deep cross purposes, which of course is a form of inequality, because there would be a winner and finally there'd be losers. Thank you very much.
That we should be very, very patient with each other, I think, is an excellent thing that we should thank Bob for. I would like to ask each of the presenters one question, and then we will have plenty of time to open it up to the floor. So I'm going to read both of my questions from here and then have you speak alternate, okay? Keita, my question for you is that you raised the phenomenon of self-transformation as a component of the schooling you were talking about, yes? And when you talked about that, I thought about Bildung, a more Germanic tradition in which transformation, Bildung, is the purpose of education. Could you then maybe talk a little bit about any similarities about Bildung and the sort of self-transformation education that you were referring to?
Sorry, what's Bildung?
Bildung, German word about cultivation of education. Education is cultivation of the self, transformation of the self. Yeah. Often claimed that it doesn't have a very clear translation, so I'm just trying to, yeah. Okay, and now I will ask Bob. You noted.
Your question, right?
No, I'm going to ask both questions.
Well, you're asking me.
I'm going to ask you a question, and then Keita will
You asked me
speak.
that
Okay?
question.
No, that was for me.
No.
Oh, good.
No.
Answer
No,
it.
but this will give him a little chance to think about it while I ask you a
Okay.
question. Okay. No, but when it's your turn, my question for you is, you named several name changes in the field over history, change from colonialism to development. Okay, named. Could you talk a little bit about the degree to which those name changes reflected actual changes in the agendas? Did or did not? Okay, that's the question. Thank you. Keita, could you go?
Yep. Oh, thank you. Thanks for the question. Well, thanks for the question. I have to admit that I have never heard of the term "building."
Sorry.
I thought you were saying "build on" in English. Yeah, I'm trying really hard to understand this notion of self-transformation, process of doing the field work as a process of self-transformation. I can't really directly answer the question, but what really struck me when I was interviewing all those Japanese area study experts is that many of them, initially when they started their graduate studies, many of them are really theoretically oriented. A lot of them have really solid understanding of Talcott person, structuration, idea of structuration by Giddens and so forth, right? So they said, well, I want to use Giddens' notion of structuration in order to understand the development of higher education in Vietnam. Then they went into one of those national universities to study comparative international education. Then they have the first meeting with the professor. And the first thing the professor said to them is, throw away those theories. Forget about theories. What you're going to do in the next 2 years to learn the language, go to the country, and then spend there for 2 years and come back and tell me if you want to do the study that you just proposed. So many of them are basically quite shocked in their first meeting, being told to throw away the theory. That's rubbish. That's the term that they often use. And then they go to whatever the country they're interested in, spend 2 years, a year learning the language, and then come back and have a meeting with the professor and then they usually say, you're right. It just doesn't make sense. So I think that's also part of the transformation. And then oftentimes when they try to critique the scholarship, comparative education scholarship as appeared in CER and those English language journals, they say there's no evidence of disintegration in this field work based upon which the study is presented. There's no evidence of it. So that's what they mean by shallowness. Is that a clear explanation to me? Well, I don't know. I'm still trying to figure that out. So I'm continuing with my research. But I think there's something similar to the notion of building, as you explained. To me, as I understand it, it's a pedagogic notion, and a learning as a self-transformation and a self-discovery. I was just struck that there's so much emphasis on changing yourself in the course of fieldwork. It's something that I don't necessarily listen to often in North America, for example. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.
Do you mind?
Probably turn these on, right?
Yeah, thank you. Do you mind if I add something to that? Yeah, please. Can you hear me at the back? Can you hear? Oh. I'm having trouble hearing at the front. I ask Keita's permission. I would add to this around the Problematik of, let us say, Bildung, or let us say some French notion of proper education, that you're not necessarily offered it. So in Nazi Germany, it's not really on offer. And if were there to be a German colony in Southwest Africa, Bildung would not necessarily be on offer. And if you were Vietnamese under French occupation, you might be, or colonialism, you might be offered a French education, but it wasn't something that you self-picked. So it was picked for you through particular schools, which of course Vietnamese children went to, but then having reached a certain level of excellence in French and in thinking like the French did, they could go to Paris and then return as part of a French as part of an assistant colonial elite to the French. Same for India. So the concept of an identity from the metropole can be reaffirmed, but it's definitely an elite form of education, or it can be cancelled. You're simply not offered it. If you're a Bumiputra in Malaya, you're not going to get many offers to behave like somebody from Eton, or, like our foreign secretary, for example. And your question was, this business of the names changing and what real difference does that make? Well, the simplest one, of course, is the department in the Institute of Education in what was then the University of London, being a department of colonial studies, and it trained colonial officers, and including missionaries. When it became the Department in Tropical Areas, which was post-1945, it actually began to train Africans to run the African education systems. When it became education in developing countries, you couldn't have that before you had theories of development. So you needed to have the invention of theories of development by the human capital theorists, and by people like Phil Foster, who wrote a brilliant commentary and critique on Ghana. You needed to have theoreticians of development before you can have departments of education and development. And the EID one is a very interesting and relatively recent shift. And to have a department which is now labeled Education and International Development, you need agencies of international development, both at the international and national levels, because you need an alliance with those for your funding. You need an alliance for those for career structures for the young people, the Japanese, increasingly the Chinese, and so on, who studying in London, so that they can participate in the work of developing. So there's a powerful sociological and political overlap between the name and the work which is done. And of course, the size of the departments, yeah, I mean, a big one for education in the colonies, and then rather a little one, education in tropical areas. But then suddenly it's really big business again, education, international development.
So I'll run around the room with the microphone and pass it around in a second, but I want to ask a question first. I really enjoyed both presentations. Thank you so much. I also really liked the way they spoke to each other, and I guess I got a question for each of you that's going to ask you to speak to each other's presentation. You know, Bob, hearing Keita's presentation before yours, I thought that he made a clear case that there's a long tradition of applied comparative education, so clearly not something entirely new. So I was curious to hear from you what you thought about the novelty of the contemporary applied comparative education. And then Keita, I was interested, you know, Bob makes an argument that the current applied comparative ed paradigm has a freeing potential for a kind of academic comparative education. Maybe that's what your work fits in, I don't know. I'm just curious what you thought about that distinction or the possibility of that distinction.
Me?
I wasn't really, I just find it difficult to make sense of the freedom that you've talked about. The fact because of the dominance of applied comparative education in the field, paradoxically, we were sort of enjoying the freedom to be really being able to develop sort of critical line of analysis. I guess the kind of work that I presented today, maybe it's a product of that freedom that you are talking about. But how is that the dominance of applied comparative education actually creates the kind of freedom that we are enjoying? I don't see that connection. Can you explain on that?
Yeah. There are two arguments here. I'm sorry, for some reason, maybe jet lag or something, I seem to have gone deaf this week. Normally, I can hear reasonably well. My argument, or the argument here would be this. It is true that conventionally most young academics in most universities in neoliberal states must still teach a certain amount. They must still have 6 doctoral candidates, and they must have a measurable contract research income. It might be relatively big. If they're a full professor, it might be relatively small if they're mid-career people. But once you have done those things, you're free to write. But the thing that loosens the whole thing up is that traditionally comparative educationists have become specialists not simply in comparative education, but they become specialists in curriculum, or they become specialists in teacher education, or they become specialists in vocational technical education, and thus they have tended to become experts on policy in teacher education, policy in vocational technical, and policy in whatever, universities or something. And so what this means is that when they're trying to do their comparative, they're looking to Germany for vocational technical, they're looking to the States for the equivalent of MITs and, you know, hotshot, cutting-edge outfits, and they're looking to, let us say, France for, well, no English person would necessarily look toward France, but they should, because the French have, in many ways, much better elite institutions than the British schools such as Rugby and Eton and Harrow. I mean, the French have really serious elite institutions, not, as David Phillips still here? What about the other David from Oxford? Not loose elite institutions like Oxford and Cambridge, yeah. All right? So that would be the nature, the way in which I'd see it, that comparative educationists are released from the historic burden of having a second identity which is de facto about policy.
Thank you very much. Let me say that I enjoyed immensely both presentations. Now, as an old hand in this business, I was indeed very active in the 1960s when we were engaged in the methods wars that you mentioned, Robert. And the reason why we were very much involved and argued with Kandel, with Noah, Harold Noah, and the other people, that Philip Foster and so on, was that comparative education at that time was a very amorphous field. Amorphous. Completely, it was anything. And therefore, we spent a lot of time trying to make it a discipline of a kind. No, but that's not the point, that because you mentioned that. What I wanted to ask you here now, I was very much intrigued by a lot of things. One of the things is the subject matter of comparative education. You raised the question of Bildung. Now, in the 1960s, when we were trying to develop comparative education as a discipline, we had a special view of education. What we meant by education, we didn't mean schooling only. We meant Paideia, culture, Bildung, Kultur general, which has disappeared now from discussions in comparative education. And therefore, I wanted to ask you, when it became, in the 60s, by the way, we were discussing indeed whether it should be an applied comparative education or other. And we were against that. But it became later on. Would you say then that when it became an applied field, and with the work that the UNESCO and so on, I argue today it had lost its soul.
So?
And as you know, in my writings now, and what I say is that the development of the field, it has been transformed from a historical, humanistic discipline to codes, sorry about that, a social science, an empirical, practical social science. And it has lost, in doing so, it became very enriched, but it had lost its soul, its humanistic element. Would you agree with that that thesis I have at the moment, both of you? Thank you.
Thanks, Andreas. So the kind of shift from historical humanist sort of motif of the field towards a social science, that kind of change that you talked about. To me, that distinction is actually not quite, doesn't sit well with me. Here's the reason. Because the critique that I provided around Kandel's work, to me, he's quintessentially historian and a humanist, right? A kind of liberal humanist sort of a tradition that you're trying to encourage us to remember, not to forget. Then the argument that I made was, look, even that rather romanticized notion of humanist tradition of the discipline was deeply, deeply entangled with the coloniality, the point that I made. Then moving on to talk about social science, the rise of social science in the field. If you look around, how many of us are coming from a social science background, practicing applied comparative education, being deeply involved in international consultancy? Yeah, working with the UNESCO, World Bank, all sorts of international development partners. To me, Well,
It's not idea, it's schooling and so on.
yeah, I agree. But fundamentally to me, the legacy of colonialism continue to survive despite this shift that you're talking about from humanist tradition to social science. The field continues to entangle with the legacy of colonialism, even today. How we engage with international development partners, the kind of logic that is underpinning development work that we're engaged. So to me, that distinction that you're making between humanist and social science is something else that needs to be exposed, that is the undercurrent of coloniality that underpins both the humanist tradition as well as the social science tradition of the field.
I think, thank you, Andreas. I actually could hear what you said, which has improved my afternoon a lot. You've gone deaf as well? I said I could actually hear what you said, so I was thanking you, which is very good. Well, I couldn't when you turned to the audience to be dramatic, but when you were talking to me, I could hear. I would offer you the following suggestion. One of the things that comparative education was struggling with in this period, the late 50s, early 60s, was how do you understand foreign societies? What is the way in which you can do that? And one of the early answers was a very nebulous concept, national character. And national character was an awkward one because it finishes up with questions like Germans work very hard, and then the Americans say, well, we work harder, so that can't be German national character, and so on. It gets you into rather trivial arguments about what it is and how it can be proven to exist. So, in my view, the next step there was to look at traditions of knowledge as a way to understand societies. And thus, in the work of Joseph Laureis, he distinguished at the philosophic level between, more or less at the philosophic level, he distinguished between Bildung, culture generale, and Marxist notions of a good socialist person. So using concepts of knowledge drawn from Descartes, drawn from Humboldt, drawn from John Locke, he argued that there were these identities, and then this is the next shift in the argument. Notice those are the small print, it's the way to understand an education system, but notice that it's a measurement of the outcome of an education system. So if you understand that the Germans are encyclopedists plus Bildung, and if you understand that the French are encyclopedists plus Descartes, and if you understand that the English are John Locke and essentialism, then you have actually not only gone a long way toward understanding the society, but you have a measure of outcome. But obviously that measure of outcome is completely different from a PISA measure of outcome. And so the assumption by Laureis and so on was that they'd understood in an important way, almost at the level of Verstehen, they'd understood the nature of societies, and so comparative education had a big leap forward. That way of thinking about societies is no longer acceptable. The correct way to think about societies is through measurement of university rankings, measurement of PISA scores, etc., unless, of course, you go to a different theoretical formulation completely and start talking about dependentia or start talking about colonialism and so on. But that is my suggestion about the way comparative educationists thought they were understanding societies and were actually coming up with very important interpretive tools, because if you understood France and, let's say, England, and let's say Dewey and America, you also, by extension, understood the colonial forms of those. Because they had been exported. They'd been exported to the French colonies in Africa, to the French colonies in Southeast Asia. The English had exported, etc., and the Scottish to Canada, and so on. So it was a remarkable gestalt for that moment in comparative time.
I know we could probably sit here and talk about this for the next hour, but I'm afraid we're out of time. That's a great idea. But this is why we get together. So thank you.